Appreciate everybody being here. I was asked to talk about deer management today. Funny deal, I kind of grew up in Mississippi and I've deer hunted my whole life, I guess, but since I was probably, I don't know, 12 or 13 or so, like most kids. Some of them starting earlier, I guess, now. But I've always enjoyed deer hunting. We always have eaten deer, but professionally, I've always been more of an avian ecology type person, upland avian, and I've always been more of a fire ecology type person. Plant ecology, I'm the plant nerd. Brady and I, I'm one of the ones that people ask plants from time to time. I've always enjoyed deer, but I never really did much with it professionally. And then I was kind of forced to. What do they say? We have an opportunity. Had an opportunity to do deer management, and I came to really enjoy it because, as I was telling Nicole earlier, deer do right. Whenever we do things with deer management, and again, working with game birds, I work with bobwhites. When we do bobwhite management, bobwhites tend to respond favorably, and we can tell. I've done work with other birds, and sometimes they just don't respond, and it bothers you. But with deer, we have so much good data, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And also, deer actually respond to management really well, and I'll talk about that. So that's what has made deer fun for me to work with, even though I wouldn't call myself much of a deer person. I don't, go home and read the deer magazines like people do and salivate over the big bucks. I certainly enjoy those, and they're nice to look at and whatnot, but definitely not been top tier my priority, although I still enjoy deer management. So real quick, I'll just talk a little bit about whitetail deer biology first off. I think most of you are familiar with deer from the standpoint that they probably, anything in the cervid group, what makes them interesting in some ways is that they have antlers. That means every year when you see a deer with big antlers, that deer has shed those antlers and regrown 100% of that tissue every year. Antlers are actually some of the fastest growing tissue on the planet. Cervids include things like elk. So if you've seen those great old big elk racks, 300 inches worth of antler, it has to regrow that every year, which is pretty crazy to think about. Also, deer and other cervids are kind of interesting from the standpoint that they have seasonal reproduction that people are familiar with. We talk about deer in the rut. And it's this really cool process. Again, like I say, I'm not necessarily one that reads the hunting magazines all the time, but I do find the physiology of the rut to be very interesting. It actually has multiple feedback mechanisms. If you're familiar with the rut, there'll be bucks and does. And everybody says, what triggers the rut? There's all these wives' tales. Oh, it'll be the first full moon in November. It'll be this, it'll be that. But it's really not. We've done research on all that. It doesn't seem to be linked to anything, like moon phase or anything like that. Basically, there's this complex feedback mechanism where when does become sexually mature, and they're going to be sexually mature based on when they're born, right? It's a 200-day gestation, so if the does are dropped in June, July, they're going to be sexually mature, November, December time frame. And then it starts this feedback mechanism, whereas the does have pheromones that trigger the bucks to do certain behaviors. Those behaviors trigger the does to do things, and it's this complex feedback loop that's just really interesting. It's also something we can observe in real time, right? If you're in the woods, you can see the different reproductive behavior in deer, right? They have places that they lick and that they rub and they scrape and do these fun things. And so it's something that people can partake in. They can actually kind of see all this biology unfolding in front of themselves. So very interesting there. In general, the other thing I guess it's important in terms of reproduction, deer tend to have 1 to 3 fawns per reproductive event, per annual cycle, let's say. And another thing I wanted to bring up, I guess, they have a 28-day estrus cycle, and when a doe comes into heat, if she's not bred, she'll come back into heat 28 days later. So that's important because if we have an unbalanced sex ratio, if they're way skewed to where there's too many does and not enough bucks, and does aren't getting bred, that can elongate that rut. We can have a really long breeding season, kind of unnaturally long. And in fact, we believe naturally they're adapted to have close to a 1-to-1 sex ratio, most of the does getting bred in that one estrus cycle, so they have kind of a satiation effect with their populations. In other words, we're putting a lot of fawns on the ground at one time, and if they have mesomammal predators or things that are trying to eat the fawns, they could be satiated and we could get ahead of any type of predation. But when we see kind of unnatural sex ratios where we have way more does than bucks, that spreads that breeding period out, And so we have late drop fawns. If you're seeing spotted fawns in November, that's kind of bad. That's not really something that's that the deer are kind of adapted to have those late drop fawns. And in fact, we know those late drop fawns don't really ever catch up physiologically. I said 1 to 3 fawns per doe. We've actually done health checks before where we've seen as many as 5 fetuses in a doe. That's very uncommon, but it can happen. Most of the time it's going to be that 2. They average 1 buck, 1 doe. It tends to be close to that 1-to-1 born in natural, in a natural setting. That surprises a lot of people. They think deer like goats, right? They're going to be 1 buck and they'll have several does, but in actuality, that's not really the way that it goes. Another thing that's interesting, and we'll talk about some of these biology things first, and then I'll talk a little bit more about some of the services we provide in terms of the agency and some of the research that we've done with Mississippi State and the like. But this is an example of some of the research that we've been able to do with Mississippi State that kind of lends itself to some of these discussions. So basically when we talk about deer movements, and that's big questions we get, why are we seeing deer at certain times of day, and why are the bucks moving in this way and not that? Sometimes these questions are difficult, right? People ask me, I get frustrated. Individual landowners will say, hey, if I plant this row of trees here, do you think deer will use it? Yeah, they probably will, I don't know. But in terms of science and biology and things that we look at, when we start talking about deer movements, it's important to know that it's highly variable. So bucks and does have different seasonal home ranges. And when we talk about a home range, that's over the whole year, annual home range. And on average, we would say a buck home range is about 1,000 acres. Well, that's highly variable. We've got some places where the home ranges will be big, even as big as 2,000 acres. And we had a buck that used public land, as a matter of fact, in Mississippi that had about a 300-acre home range, very small home range. I've seen a study in Louisiana where they had a doe home range that was like 120 acres, so pretty small home ranges in some cases. But in general, I feel like those are still pretty good numbers. Now, one of the most interesting things that we see is that bucks can take excursions, which are big movements outside of their home range. So people call us now, especially now that we've got all these deer cameras. Everybody's familiar, people checking their cell phones. They'll see a new buck pop up on their property and they'll say, what's this buck? We haven't seen him. Have you seen him? Whatever. Very common for bucks to have excursions, big movements outside their home range. We had one, I think you guys have seen it probably on social media. Mississippi State reported a lot of it. We actually had a buck that swam the Mississippi River twice. Went all the way across. He had about 20, I think it was a 28-mile excursion. He went from the South Delta of Mississippi and went all the way to Tallulah, Louisiana, and then came back. And it was actually really an odd scenario. It wasn't due to hunting pressure because he was in a hunted area during the hunting season and went to an unhunted area during the not hunting season. I don't know, either not intelligent, who knows. But the reality of the situation is that big movements are common. Now, we did see some pretty interesting things. Bucks tend to have personalities, you might say. So some of the bucks are sedentary and they'll be a really tight home range. Some of them make big movements. And this is actually 2 different bucks in Mississippi, so that's pretty cool. But in general, we will see most of your movements are going to be kind of stable throughout the year. That has to do, of course, with resources. During the summertime, they don't have to move quite as much. And as they get to the winter, boom, you see this. Whenever this is buck movements, we see increased miles traveled, daily distance traveled throughout during the winter, during the rut period. The other thing that we see is diurnally. So during the day, obviously they're crepuscular. So they're going to move a lot in the morning. This is morning movement, and this is evening movement. Even in the rut, that's morning and evening. So people will say, oh, we'll see all these bucks, way more bucks in the daytime. Yeah, I mean, that's possible. But in fact, they're going to move most of the time. Even during the rut, they're going to be moving in the morning and the evening. They're crepuscular. Well, one thing I did want to call out yearling buck dispersal. So we hear a lot of people talking about, well, I don't want to get too much into that. Again, I'm going to run out of time. But basically, those yearling bucks, those young bucks, even though they're going to keep a home range, they're generally a good number of those are going to disperse. And they disperse at different times of year. Some of them will disperse before the end of the hunting season. Some of them will disperse early in the hunting season. But in general, 50 to 75% of the bucks, the yearling bucks on a property, are going to disperse off that property before their first annual cycle. Now, in terms of nutrition, and this is actually some of the stuff that I've enjoyed the most, learning about selection, and kind of like we were talking about earlier with Tom, why do they eat in certain things and not others? Why do they tend to select things and avoid other things? And at the end of the day, nutritional wisdom is something that's really weird to try to think about, particularly in mammals and some other animals. But it does seem that in general, they're going to seek out foods with a little bit higher crude protein, although that's a little bit weak. And they did tend to see in some of the research, they seem to select foods with greater phosphorus, particularly in areas that have limited phosphorus. So if you get in South Mississippi, there's not a lot of phosphorus in that landscape, they might select phosphorus. But for the most part, they're actually avoiding. They have a much stronger avoidance reflex than they do selection, and they're avoiding foods that are high in sulfur. Kids don't like broccoli, right? It's high in sulfur. It's bitter taste. It's not a good taste. And so when they eat sulfur, there's a negative feedback, right? So they have a negative association with sulfur. And so we see certain foods that they tend to avoid tend to be high in sulfur, which is kind of interesting. They do tend to select a lot of broadleaf herbaceous plants. We call those forbs. But they also eat a lot of lignified tissue. They eat a lot of brush, woody, the succulent ends of woody species. They'll eat brambles, briars, things with stickers. That doesn't seem to bother them very much, but they do avoid what we call lignified tissue. So once it gets to a certain point where it's coarse and it's undigestible, they tend to avoid it. In general, deer are going to eat, this is seasonal, of course, depending, but 6% of their body weight a day in browse. That's a lot. Over the course of an annual cycle, that'll be a ton of browse for a 100-pound doe. Or a 200-pound buck, that'd be 2 tons of browse that they would eat in the course of an annual cycle. Now, we do have nutritional stress periods for deer that are important, and I'm going to talk about that later on. Basically, this is looking at kidney fat index here, and the blue line is actually the females or the does. The red line is the bucks, and this is, again, kidney fat index. So when we start talking about organ fat is the last fat that an animal is going to lose. Like if I became nutritionally stressed, hopefully I'm going to lose a little around the middle, right? I hope. A little bit right here maybe. That'd be good if I'm nutritionally stressed. The last fat that your body will give up is the fat around your organs. That's the fat that protects them, right? It insulates your organs. But when we see deer actually giving up that organ fat, that's when we know they're nutritionally stressed. So when these lines are low, that means we've got a really stressed animal. And for does, that's going to be during lactation and during gestation. Lactation is one of the most nutritionally taxing activities that a mammal can do. And then for bucks, they're going to see a high level of nutritional stress during the breeding season. So whenever they're doing all that running around rutting, they forget to eat, right? They're chasing ladies and they wake up out of that rut and they go, wait a minute, I forgot to eat for like 2 months. What's going on? And guess what? That's in February, when they come out of the rut. So that's a nutritional stress period. Just naturally, obviously, there's going to be nutritional stress in the winter because there's less food available. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about just kind of general biology, last little bit of general biology, population dynamics. So deer, even though they just have that average 2 fawns per doe, we don't have a lot of adult mortality in deer. So that means even though they're just replacing themselves in the population every year, it would seem like, since we don't have a lot of adult mortality, those does are generally going to stay alive, the bucks and does. We're the primary source of mortality, right? And so we can have exponential growth in a deer herd. And so this is an example in Pennsylvania where they had a square mile essentially that they were monitoring, and they started with 2 pregnant females, and they saw that over the course of 9 years, 2 pregnant females turned into 180 deer in that square mile. 180 deer in 9 years. Then they went in and did a removal basically and got down to about 4 deer. And then in the course of just a few short 4 years, you get up to 232 deer. That's remarkable population growth. Again, it has a lot to do with the fact that the adults, there's not a lot of adult mortality. So every time their reproduction replacing themselves, you think about it, it's just exponential growth. Literally, closest thing we would have to exponential growth in that type of situation. Now, when we start talking about management, so I've talked a lot about now just general deer biology. We're going to talk about management going forward. When we talk about management, we talk about it like a 3-legged stool, essentially. We've got population management or herd management, and then habitat management, so we're managing the environment. and people management. And that's how we're going to kind of break it up. So obviously, if any one of those falls apart, we can actually see it not going well. We've got to manage that deer herd imbalance, not only managing the habitat or the environment, but also managing the herd, which we do through harvest management. I haven't figured out how to manage people yet, but if anybody knows, see me after. Seriously, I'm just going to talk briefly, just one slide on people management. One of the most important things when we work with landowners, and so now I'm going to get into the part about how we work as an agency with private landowners. One of the most important things that we do is actually help landowners talk through their goals and objectives. So because white-tailed deer are very important, and I didn't present any information on this, but you could do a whole presentation on the economic value, the cultural value, the significance of white-tailed deer to the human population. Given all those things, we have some important I guess I would say responsibilities to our constituents, to our stakeholders. And one of those things is to help them meet their objectives. The agency may have objectives that we would like to see in the whole deer herd, the deer population. We want it to be healthy, certainly. But an individual landowner has the right to manage their deer herd, to meet their objectives, however they want to. And so we'll talk through all these situations with the individual landowners, and I actually enjoy doing that to figure out kind of, what do you want out of this land? And sometimes it's kind of a funny discussion, right? Sometimes people don't know what they want. But we've actually done surveys, and pretty commonly people will say the number one reason that they would participate in DMAP, which I'm about to talk about, but basically participate in deer management, is the health of the herd. Everybody can kind of get behind that for the most part. But as you can see, there are different things. Quality bucks tends to be a high one. Down in the bottom end, reduced crop damage. Only a very few people are going to be, and if it's important to you, it's very important, but there's only a very few people that's going to be important to. Managing the size of the deer population. You can see all these different potential objectives. So I'm not going to spend any time other than this slide talking about that. I just want to make it clear that as an agency, we don't necessarily come onto a person's property and tell them what to do. That's not what we're in the business of. We're in the business of working with landowners and trying to find out what they want and then helping them meet that objective. Now, if their objective is to clone deer or do something illegal, that's cut out, obviously, right? Within the law, that's what we're going to try to do when we work with those landowners. So that gets us to herd management. I'm going to talk about habitat management last. When we talk about herd management, I just got through showing that exponential growth slide. So that can be problematic. Why? I'm sure people are thinking about this. Well, if we have too many deer, it's like having too many cows. They eat too much. It's not good. All right? And so one of the ways that we're going to manage nutrition is by managing the herd. So with white-tailed deer, it's pretty important and pretty interesting. When we take that 1.65 was the lambda, what we would call the population growth rate. If you take that population growth rate and apply it out and then have removal, so this is assuming harvest over time, if we're only harvesting 10% of the population, we're still seeing a growing population. If we harvest as much as 20% of the population, again, still a growing population. We have to harvest a third of the population annually to be able to maintain that population at a steady level. Now you say, I said harvest, we have to remove, there has to be removal. So we do have some natural mortality, right? Bucks have natural mortality during the rut. You can have, we actually had a study on the big black. We had 16% mortality during rut for bucks. A lot of it was brain abscesses from fighting. So there's gonna be some amount of removal that's gonna occur that's not harvest. But in general, we want around that 30 to 20% harvest on any population that's growing. Now, some of them aren't growing at that. We've assumed a 1.65 lambda. Not every population is going to have that growth rate. But in general, that's a lot of harvest. So to help get to that, and where we work with landowners a lot is with data collection. And that's our, what we call DMAP, Deer Management Assistance Program. We've had that around for quite a while, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The reason DMAP is so important to us is because 80% of the state's land base is privately owned. So again, like I was talking about, we can't tell folks what to do on their own land. We have to work with them. 90% of the days hunted, 90% of the days spent afield are on private lands. So our hunters, my constituents, people that pay for my salary by buying hunting licenses, are actually using the private land extensively, and that's important for us to know and for us to work with those folks. I kind of talked about all this a little bit in bits and pieces, so I don't want to go too much into it. getting a little bit behind on time too, but I did want to call out that DMAP was actually first developed in the state of Mississippi and is now gone out to probably 30 different states that have a DMAP program. It was developed in the late 70s by Dave Gwynn at Mississippi State, was the professor, but Ed Hackett, who's one of my mentors, he actually wrote the original document. Some of you may know Ed. I reference that with some regularity, very interesting. But to think we're coming up now, if you think 77, by 2027 we'll come up on 50 years of having DMAP, and we're excited about that. And we're actually going to have a meeting here in 2027 where we're going to feature the anniversary, I guess, of DMAP. So what is DMAP? I've talked about it a lot. It's actually one of the first and one of the earliest instances of citizen science used to manage a wildlife population. So now, how many of you have the bird apps or the apps where you can say, I saw this bird or I saw this thing? They're using that data now. People like us use that data. It's citizen science. We can actually use detections, not presence, absence, but we can get abundances in some cases from that data. But with DMAP, it's actually pretty interesting. We ask the hunting clubs that we work with, they actually collect harvest data. So an individual club, if they participate, when they harvest a deer, they will actually pull the jawbone and get weights and some other data from that deer and provide that to us at the end of the deer season. And we use that data to do a whole lot of stuff. Basically, with the jawbone, we can get age. And when we have age and body condition, carcass condition by age class, we can use that to reconstruct populations. We can do all kinds of things with that data. And I'm going to show you some examples here in a minute. In return, the clubs get a report from us and we give them some recommendations. They also are eligible for tags where they can kill additional deer. They also get, nowadays we've gotten to where we can give them special seasons so they can get additional opportunity if they participate. It used to be a little bit more of a carrot back when you couldn't kill as many does. About the 90s, we had probably peak DMAP performance or DMAP participation was in the late 90s when people needed to be in DMAP to be able to get that additional doe opportunity. Now we've kind of liberalized the seasons a little bit, so we have a little bit less incentive in some cases. This is just an example. Again, we could do a whole presentation and have done whole presentations talking about the benefits of DMAP. But what we've got here is actually the number of years participated in DMAP. So starting at year 0, these are clubs that have participated 5 years in DMAP, 15 years, and 25 years. One of the interesting things is in year 0, their average buck age is about 2-year-old, and we're gradually getting them to be older bucks. What happens there is once they're calibrating themselves as observers. So when we pull the jawbones, I've actually got clubs now that have been in DMAP 20 years. They write on the back of the little card, they guess the age, and they're right, 90% of the time. And so once they learn how to age those bucks on the hoof, they get better over the course of time at allowing the bucks to get older. And the way that we grow large antlered animals, there's 3 ingredients to a large antlered animal, a large antlered buck, and that's age, nutrition, and genetics. We don't manage genetics, and generally in Mississippi, we don't have a genetic limitation. The big thing is age. We try to let the bucks get older. Another thing that's interesting, I guess I would call out, is lactation percent. So when we start working with clubs, around 60% lactation is a good baseline. That's a population that's reproducing. Remember I talked about that lambda. If we're around 60% lactation, and the way they do that when they kill a doe, they look for evidence of lactation. Around 65% is a good growing population, right? So when they start harvesting does at a high level this year 5, look at the lactation went up. That's very common. We see that. When we go in and start harvesting and removing animals, there's more vegetation, there's more nutrition, and so they get healthier, better carcass condition, more reproduction. And you're like, wait a minute, I was trying to remove deer, and they do everything they can to resist being removed. This is not right, but over time they actually can get through that. So you can see up to around 70% lactation, and eventually that kind of tapers off. They get to what we call a maintenance harvest, and I've been able to see that happen in the field. It's pretty interesting to watch and see how these populations respond to removal. I could talk about this a long time, but it's not very interesting for a lot of people, so I'll come back to this if anybody has any questions. Now, what's interesting, I guess, in the context of today is that we actually have, we can take that data, by the way, and reconstruct the deer population. So you can basically reverse age of deer. If you have a 5-year-old jawbone, we know when that deer was born, and we know how many deer were born that year. And so when we get down the road, we can reconstruct the population. And we also survey deer hunters And we figure out kind of participation rates, removal, et cetera, et cetera. And we use that to estimate how many deer we had at certain times of year, or I'm sorry, in certain years and certain points in the past. And so you can see we've got a growing reconstructed deer population. We start back in the 80s there when the DMAP data is really coming into fruit, and you can see gradual increase in the 90s, pretty dense deer herd, probably at some of the higher deer herds we've ever had on the landscape, at least since we've been recording and keeping up with this data. Interestingly, though, total deer harvest is actually declining. So we have less people killing less deer at an increasing deer herd. More deer on the landscape maybe than we've ever had now, possibly. Now, that's very highly variable geographically in the state. If you're familiar with deep South Mississippi, potentially less deer, maybe not as good as soils or good as cover types, and so we have lower reproductive rates. If you get in far northeast Mississippi, same situation, maybe not as high a reproductive rate. But in general, we probably have more deer now than we've had at least in the last 200 years. So very interesting situation to be in. Incidentally, we see a decline in participation in DMAP. And there's a lot of reasons for this. We used to have DMAP back when people were leasing timber company land. You know, everybody wanted to get in these big leases and they enjoyed participating in DMAP. Now our land ownership patterns changed. Our median land ownership size that my program that we work with is 200 acres. So your average deer hunter anymore that doesn't want to be a member of a 5,000 acre club, they want to have their own 100 acres where they can do whatever they want to on it. And so those people are less incentivized to participate in DMAP. And again, they're probably less incentivized to kill a lot of deer. So we see a lot of changes. They're just natural. So moving on, looking at deer habitat. I talked about herd management. Now we're going to talk about habitat management. So, and a lot of our metrics have to do with carcass condition, but we know the kind of the elephant in the room is antler size, antler characteristics. So big antler deer tend to be what most folks want. What we found, and this is Mississippi State data, we've seen this in several different studies, though they've repeated similar stuff in Texas. If we get deer to a higher protein diet, and this diet was 16% crude protein, obviously we're going to see an increase over time. So this is the age of the deer. This is mean Boone and Crockett score. I probably should explain some of these things. This is mean Boone and Crockett score. So that's an index, we'll say, of antler size, how big the antlers are. And so over time, you have a natural increase as deer age to have bigger antlers. We kind of already mentioned that a little bit. But at the higher protein level, 16% crude protein, we see larger antlers than this was 9% crude protein. In general, maintenance is going to be like 8% crude protein. That's pretty low protein, but a doe requires as much as 12, 14% crude protein for maintenance if she's lactating. So 16% is a good number, high crude protein. So how do we make sure that we're providing that higher crude protein level for different deer, or I guess for the deer herd that we're managing? And there's a bunch of different ways to do that. For one thing, we talked about earlier, deer are concentrate selectors when we talked about their diet. So deer have a narrow mouth and they pick out the more nutritious and succulent parts of a plant anyway, right? If you look at the things they eat, they don't eat the big sticks of the trees. They're just eating the little buds. They don't eat the sticky parts of the briars. They just eat the pretty leaves. So naturally, they're trying to get a better diet on their own, but we can do that by providing more of the more nutritious plants with our management. And in general, we group browse into three groups. We would say shrubs, and this is actually strawberry bush, picture there. Shrubs or woody browse. Now, shrubs we would put in the same category as trees or woody browse. Forbs, and this is actually oldfield aster. You can see it's been selected highly. And then I would put this as forages. So these are managed forages like clovers where we're actually intentionally managing those for food for deer. And so we'll kind of talk about how we use all those different categories of browse when we're doing management. So I'm going to talk a lot in the weeds here in a minute, but understand that a lot of this stuff too is happening at the landscape scale. So I mentioned South Mississippi where we have different cover types, we have different soil types. This data is actually taking South Mississippi specifically, looking at the coastal plain and saying, looking at antler size, you know, when we see the percentage of pine on the landscape So as we get to the landscape, and the landscape scale in this case was 15,000 acres, if we get a 15,000 acre block that's 80, 90% pine, on average, we're going to have smaller antlered deer. And this has got a lot to do with management, not just because there's pine trees. And we're going to talk about that as we go forward. These are just closed canopy, kind of unmanaged pine stands. So in general, management or lack of management can have a big effect at a landscape scale on the deer herd. This is just an example of changes. This is the Big Black River here. We're on Yazoo-Madison County line. You can see what it looked like in 1989, and we see a big change, a lot of afforestation. Some of this is CRP and different things like that coming in, and so we've had afforestation in this landscape, which can be good for a lot of critters, but that was at the expense of soybeans. In this case, a lot of this is open ag. Some of it was cotton, actually. You look at a lot of cotton coming out, but the open agriculture probably had a little higher nutritional plane for whitetails. So one of the ways that we estimate nutrition, they look at what they call a nutritional carrying capacity. And we assume, the way we do that, I guess, is we look at the maintenance level of protein that deer need in a daily protein intake. And then they take the levels of forage and they grind them up. And I've done a lot of this, unfortunately, in the past. But we pick all the forage, we dry it down, we grind it up, and we digest it. Believe it or not, you can digest it in a lab. And we figure out the amount of crude protein in the different forages. And then we get the tonnages for the different forages. And so that's how we can kind of gather management data. We say, if I did this type of management, I actually increased that nutritional plane for white-tailed deer. And this is some data. I'm going to show some other data with nutritional carrying capacity. But this is data from the state of Tennessee, in East Tennessee actually, where we were doing some different forest management treatments. And we were doing canopy manipulation in combination with prescribed fire. So this is a control, and this is the deer use days. The way we report this, that we do similar things for waterfowl, right? We say how many days out of a calendar year this acre would sustain a white-tailed deer. So deer days are low in the control, less than 10 deer days on an acre. When we do fire alone, we don't see much of an increase, but when we crack that canopy with a shelter wood, we see a little bit of increase. Again, canopy manipulation, see an increase. More increase with additional canopy manipulation is the point there. But the point I wanted to make with this slide is pretty interesting. These photographs are from this data. This is actually taken after we had 4 iterations of prescribed fire. So this has been burned on a 3-year rotation for 4 iterations. And you can see we changed the plant community. So if you look, the shelterwood harvest here has got more woody browse. And remember, we talked about woody browse may be a little bit less palatable than some of the broadleaf. So by burning repetitively, we've actually made this same kind of canopy manipulation. We've opened the same amount of sunlight, which is important. We got the same amount of sunlight getting to the ground, but it's being captured by less desirable woody forage here. And when we've gone in and done prescribed burning, we've actually changed the plant community to more desirable forbs in this instance. So it's pretty interesting there. And we see that in a lot of different places. This is in East Tennessee. We've done some studies like this. In Mississippi, I've seen studies like this done in Florida as well. Basically, some amount of burning can increase the nutritional plane. Now, we're going to talk about that in a minute. This was all dormant season burning. We can do different things with growing season fire as well. Now, all right, this is really ugly, but this is one of my favorite slides to talk about deer nutrition, and I'm going to explain this. So this is all the times a year when they measured deer nutrition, and this is not just this is not deer use days. This is crude protein, phosphorus, calcium, and potassium. And this is when they measured it in May, June, July, August, September. And then they measured it. This is the time since fire, and this is also when the fire was applied. So to give you an example, this is green is June applied fire in July. So look at this crude protein we see measured in July. Green is June applied fire. That's what it was before they burned it. Then they burned it, and boom, we saw crude protein get increased right after fire. We have a nutritional pulse, we call that. We would have a pulse of growth. We've made this vegetation young and succulent. Remember, lignified tissue is bad, and so we've got good green. We see that pulse. Interestingly enough, if you look at that green bar, we see the same pulse in phosphorus. Boom, this big increase in phosphorus right after we burn. So this is, again, fire, the green bar, Fire applied in June, we see a little bit of a bump in potassium even, although potassium has seasonal. One thing you can look at is the control. So it's just 1 year since fire, the purple. There's some natural seasonal changes. This crude protein kind of levels off, but you see phosphorus kind of over through the year. It just naturally is going down. But by burning in June, boom, we see this nutritional pulse. You don't see that in calcium. And what you can see is over the year, look at the purple bar, over time, calcium kind of increases naturally. Calcium manifests in older tissues. All right, the point of this big, busy slide is diversity. Diversity. We've got to have older tissues to have calcium. We have to have young, fresh tissues to have phosphorus and protein and these other nutrients. We need forbs that have different growth habits. We need woody browse that has different growth habits. We've got to have diversity. If we do the same thing over the whole landscape, we won't get all this cluttered mess of diverse pulses of nutrition. Oops. There we go. Now, there is a drawback to that, right? I was talking about burning at different times of year. Everything I've talked about up until this point has been nothing but walking stomachs. Deer are just walking stomachs, and they're just a nutritional budget. They're just a nutritional math problem. All we got to do is make more of this forage. Well, that's not entirely true, right? We still have to have cover. We have to have things to hide them. And so what we find, this is from and they've got to have also more than just forage. So we can actually burn too much, and we can burn too much at different times of year. This is actually looking at soft mass. Believe it or not, soft mass, fleshy fruits like blueberries and persimmons and things like that, blackberries, are important for white-tailed deer. They're important for birds and a number of other things. So all that burning that I was talking about can actually be negative for soft mass. Look at these two cover types, upland hardwood, bottomland hardwood. The blue bar and the yellow bar tend to have the most soft mass. The exception would be the dormant season burning on the pine. So this is things like beautyberry, blackberry briars. But when you burn in the growing season, which I was just telling you, growing season burn, nutritional pulse, yay. Growing season fire almost eliminates soft mass, right? That's when it's growing and making and trying to make it stuff, but we burned it. So we can eliminate soft mass, which is bad. The other thing, and what I'll just explain this, I guess, but this is actually looking at the same doe who had a fawn, and this is looking in North Carolina study where they're doing a lot of growing season fire. So the blue is the drain. This is like where the only place that never gets fire because it's got a streamside management zone, there's no fire. And all these different colors are the different seasons of fire. The red is a growing season fire that actually had a really high nutritional plane, but we see, and this is the home range of the doe, and during that time, she never even goes into the high nutritional plane area. Same thing, we see this doe, same doe, different years. She should have been going into this block, but she never goes into it. Why do they not go into the places with the most nutrition? It's because there was no cover. She couldn't, with her fawn, she couldn't even take her fawn into that cover. And in fact, they saw a high amount of fawn mortality in this study. They were burning so much. This is on military bases. They burn a lot for a lot of different reasons on these military bases. They were burning so much and in big blocks to where the deer were selecting areas in their home ranges that had lower nutritional plane. And in fact, to the point that some of the fawns were getting depredated probably because they were starving to death. When the fawns get to a point where they're really hungry, they start bleating, meh, you told me to do deer noise and I didn't do one. But they'll meh, meh, like a goat. And that, if you're a coyote, that's like the dinner bell ringing, you know? And so the point of all this is the diversity. I'm going back to the diversity. We need some burning in the summer. We need some burning in the winter. We need some areas that are not burned at all and undisturbed, you know, all these different things. We need some areas where timber's cut. We need some areas where they don't cut timber. It's all about diversity when we're talking about habitat management for whitetail deer. This is one of my favorite studies, and this is talking about bottomland hardwoods. This is towards the end there. I'm pretty much done. But this is actually just looking at species richness, herbaceous species richness, so the number of species counted, and this is the age of the stand. This was just a kid's master's thesis in the 90s, and I found it one day, and it was just great. I feel like a professor didn't know what to do, and he said, go out and just measure a bunch of these cuts in Delta National Forest and see what you find. And I've never seen this cited in the literature. This is just the thesis. But it was so cool because he actually had so many different ages of cuts. And you can see that as the bottomland hardwood forest ages, my point would be, that as the forest ages, there's inherent change. So we look at a forest and we say, well, it's always going to be the same. That's not true. As the forest is a 10-year-old forest, even on the same site, same soils, different site, different soils, a 10-year-old forest is quite a bit different than a 50-year-old forest or a 90-year-old forest. It doesn't mean it's better or worse. They're different. And so having different age classes in the bottomland forest, you know, I talked a lot about burning because I'm a fire guy. And I like quail birds and things like that, and they like fire. But the bottomland hardwood management is also important. And some of it being unmanaged or left to grow to an older age class, some of it being manipulated, very important. So we see diversity again, still very important. Very funny to me, the deer, I guess you think of the active management with deer, but a lot of the deer hunters, when we start talking about hardwood, it's the sacred cow thing. You know, they don't ever touch my hardwood, and so they end up having these huge blocks of sterile hardwoods, not much going on. The people that came in and said we need to manage the hardwood forest were actually the neotropical migratory bird people. They came in and said, wait a minute, this is not a diverse multi-canopy forest where we have nesting for wood thrush in the mid-story or, you know, super emergent trees and, you know, or dominant hardwoods. And so as the migratory bird folks got involved and started managing the bottomland hardwood forest, the deer people said, wait a minute, it's actually making more deer forage too. It's better for the deer. So it's just an example of where sometimes this diverse management that we're talking about is actually good for a lot of different critters. Very last thing I'll talk about is basically plantings, because I know some people are sitting in here, I want to know about what to plant for my deer. The reality situation is one of the first slides I show is talk about nutritional stress periods. So we don't do a whole lot of plantings for deer, even on WMAs, because they're very expensive, time consuming, and at the end of the day, we can do a little bit more with management techniques like fire and timber harvest. However, supplemental plantings are not bad, if done properly, I guess. They certainly can be bad. But at the end of the day, the most important thing with the supplemental plantings is trying to address the nutritional stress periods, late winter and late summer. And so if we look, we have some examples of some perennial forages. The blue lines are like white clover and chicory, which is also a perennial. You can see the perennials have just natural changes in their production, but most of that production is going to occur in the spring and summer. Your annual clovers and winter annuals, wheat and crimson clover, are going to make most of their forage, well, most of it in the spring and summer still, but a lot in that winter stress period. And your summer forages like soybeans and things like that are going to make the forage in that nutritional stress period. Again, diversity. Diversity is the theme. We want to try to have some annual forages, some perennial forages, and some cool season and warm season as well. That's pretty much all I had. Again, I don't want to, one thing, take home point, I guess, is that as an agency, we're not trying to force people to do one thing or the other for the white-tailed deer herd. You know, our goal is to actually work with the landowners and work together, try to find, you know, objectives, help them refine their objectives and see where we can plug in and help them manage. All right, that's all I got.